Today we'll be speaking about social psychological approaches to studying leisure. We'll speak of the challenge of defining and measuring leisure because there's really no right or wrong way to conceptualize and define leisure. There's different approaches and have their advantages and limitations. And some strategies work better for certain types of research questions. So we'll go over this typology of defining, observing, and measuring leisure. We'll speak about the 5 main research methods that are used in social psychology of leisure, and finally also speak of the strengths and limitations of these approaches. So just a reminder, what is leisure? Well, it is defined as an activity, and it is also often defined as something that one does in their free time. It is enjoyable. We often look at it as a freely chosen is important, that it's voluntary. And we often look at beneficial outcomes, but as we've learned about in leisure problems, there can also be negative outcomes as well. So there is challenge of defining and measuring leisure. For example, reading. Is this leisure? Typically in a class, maybe a quarter of people will raise their hand that reading is viewed as a leisure activity to them. I know people who, just devour book after book, while others, it is not an activity that they enjoy. I think it also depends what you're reading. Is it a book for pleasure or, is it schoolwork? And also how much reading you do in your job. For example, I read all day long in my job, and often at a computer or even, reading articles or textbooks. And so when I come home, personally for myself, I don't, although I do really like reading, but I don't read as much as I used to because I'm wanting to do something that's in contrast to my job. Is graffiti leisure? Some people are doing it because they think it is artistic and, it's a form of expression, while others view it as vandalism and something that should be punished. And, I agree, like, for example, on the bottom right of the screen, that's Fort Amherst. I personally think that's not very appealing, all the graffiti there at a historic site. But other places around town that are in the top right and bottom left of your screen, I think they're beautiful. So whether it's art or vandalism is often in the eye of the beholder. The image there on the left I thought was interesting. There's a tree behind that wall, and someone painted it to look like the tree was part of the character's hair. And I think that just shows how sometimes graffiti can be used to help beautify spaces. But whether it is recreation or vandalism is, often viewed differently. Soccer. Well, recreational sports are often thought most commonly when we think of recreation and leisure, but not everyone likes these activities or may not feel a sense of belonging in a team sport. And what if someone is a professional athlete? Is it still leisure? Many would say that as soon as you are paid, the leisure is lost, as you are doing it for external reasons like money. Some of you may be varsity athletes or other elite in other elite organizations. Is it always leisure to you when you have to wake up on a Friday and be at practice or training at 6 o'clock in the morning? It might not. Drinking and socializing, is that leisure? Well, most of us are doing it. It's freely chosen. It's a form of socialization. But obviously, there can be a lot of negative consequences to drinking and, to things that happen, while people are under the influence of alcohol. Arts and crafts can be leisure. Art can be done solo or in groups, and it includes any creative visual arts. For example, this is one of my main leisure activities, but for others, it might not be viewed as enjoyable. Gambling as an activity can be fun and harmless, a poker game among friends. My husband has played poker for years with friends every couple of months, just a $10 buy-in. So gambling can be social, even, a day out at the racetrack or a part of travel, like going to Vegas. But gambling can be addictive and use up a lot of discretionary income. People spend hours in front of VLT machines. Some even wear adult diapers so they don't have to get up. People gamble their life savings away in secretive online gambling behaviors. People spend money and time betting on sports. Gambling has been a leisure activity for over 3,000 years, yet it has many negative outcomes on individuals and society. So, one way of thinking of whether something is leisure or not is looking at this typology. Another word for typology is a classification system. So, in this, we can see that leisure can be viewed as a type of phenomena, either as objective or subjective. It can also be looked at from different vantage points, either external or internal. Also, we've talked about this a little bit before, but leisure can be viewed as an activity, setting, or time period, or as an experience, satisfaction, or meaning. So leisure is identified by the setting where it's experienced, for example, a party or theater or park, or it could be time free from obligation, or it could be certain feelings that are considered to be leisure, such as sense of freedom, relaxation, enjoyment, and intense concentration. So we're going to be going through what each of these are, and I'm just going to very briefly explain a few things. So the objective phenomena of leisure looks at leisure as activity, setting, and time. The subjective definition looks at it as experience, satisfaction, or meaning. The vantage point is basically who is defining leisure. Is it the researcher, or society, or is it the individual? So external means that the researcher or observer is defining leisure. So, for example, in the case of graffiti, most of the time, a researcher or observer would probably say that graffiti is not a leisure activity. Whereas the internal vantage point is the participant. So what is defined as leisure is based on how the individual feels. So in the case of graffiti, leisure would, graffiti would be defined as a leisure activity because the participant is defining it as such. So how we define leisure is based on if we're looking at something, looking at it objectively or subjectively, and whether we're looking at it from the external or internal vantage points. And I will now explain each of these at a time. So the objective type of phenomena, or what's called the behavioral approach, it focuses on what someone does, what situation they're in, or what setting they are in. So it can be an activity, what people participate in, such as measuring the number of activities that someone does. We could look at time, such as the amount of time spent in specific activities, the frequency or duration. We could also look at settings or environments that support leisure. We call these containers for leisure. Containers for leisure then is just settings where leisure occurs. And we often look at things like parks or tennis courts or parties, gathering spaces, or certain types of facilities. In contrast, with the subjective type of phenomenon, leisure is defined in terms of what people think and feel. Researchers usually measure mental experience while people are engaged in these activities and the satisfactions and meanings derived from these activities. So we're looking really at mental experience, like attitudes and beliefs. If you have a positive or negative attitude towards leisure or a particular activity, as well as feelings of enjoyment and satisfaction and the emotions that one gets from participation. We can look at leisure from two different vantage points, the external and the internal. The external vantage point, or it's the observer or the researcher, what constitutes as leisure is determined by the researcher, and usually it's based on, common views of society. So when we're looking at the external vantage point, the researcher predetermines or imposes a definition of leisure on the people that they are studying. In contrast, if you're using the internal definitional vantage point or the participant approach, the researcher leaves it up to the individual being studied to determine if an activity, setting, or experience, or even emotions is leisure for them personally. By using the individual's own definition of leisure, researchers often get a more accurate picture of how much leisure people feel they have and what is meaningful to them. Gives a clearer understanding of how leisure impacts people's lives. So it is important for you to understand these four different approaches. So you need to make sure you understand the difference between objective and subjective phenomena. That objective is an activity, setting, or time. Subjective is experience, satisfaction, or meaning. You need to understand that we can look at leisure from different points of view, whether it's from external, so an imposed definition, or internal, meaning the participant is defining what leisure is for them. Therefore, we have four different approaches then to how we define and measure leisure. And it's important then for a good multiple choice question then is providing you with examples of research, and you need to figure out which one of these four approaches it is using. Now move on to speaking about research methods that are used in studying leisure. These include experiments, inventories and surveys, budgets, time diaries, experience sampling method, naturalistic observations, and interviews. And I'm going to be going through each one of these. An experiment is an empirical approach to getting data or information about the world and a method of investigating causal relationships among variables. So causal means which comes first, A or B? Or, the chicken and egg. Is it the chicken or the egg which comes first? There's different types of experiments. There are field experiments, and these occur in the field or in the natural setting. So this could be any setting where leisure can or could occur, and this could be from outdoor recreation areas to bars. So this is when people are really observing people having leisure experiences. This has high external validity. External validity means, how real world it is. But it does have then lower internal validity, which means you're not able to control the variables or be able to know what all the factors are that are influencing the results, because you can't control things like that in a real world setting. There's also laboratory experiments. These are then occurring in controlled settings. They're not as commonly used in leisure research, and that's because it's more difficult to study cognitions and experience in leisure. It's difficult to manipulate leisure, the experience of leisure in a lab. But the good thing of experiments, though, is you can control a lot of factors. So they do have what's called high internal validity. But again, it's not what would really happen in the real world. I'm going to give an example of a leisure experiment that was conducted. This was done by Manel in 1979. He wanted to determine the influence of freedom of choice and competition on the experience of leisure. And he did a laboratory setting, so that means he's, simulating periods of free time and in which this kind of game was played. And he manipulated the setting so people would think they were having leisure. He used 60 university students. So people were randomly assigned, the 60 students, into one of four conditions or groups or experimental protocol to manipulate the independent variables, which were about sense of freedom or choice, and then also how competitive the environment was. And so some people had low choice and low competition. Others had low choice but high competition. A third group had high choice but low competition. And finally, high choice, high competition. And obviously the participants were blinded. That means they were not aware of what they were doing. And they actually thought the participants were deceived, kind of lied to. They thought they were in there to do a little bit of a learning study on using computers and eye tracking. So the participants first came in and they went into a fake room where they were supposed to do this learning experiment. I'd like you to remember that this was 1979. Computers were very new, and most people wouldn't have seen one of these. So this would have been like a cool big deal to go in and work on this. So they did a tracking task requiring them to follow a moving light on a screen with a pencil-like wand. And when they lost contact, the equipment would beep at them. But before they did that activity, they were put into a waiting room. And, they made this room look like any type of waiting room with pictures and, some magazines and a plant and that kind of thing. And they were made to feel that what happened in this room was free time, like they were just waiting before they had to do the experiment. But in fact, what happened in this waiting room was actually the real experiment. So while they were in this room, they had a grad student come in and say, "Hey, I'm just developing a new game, a new board game. Would you help me and do the game and, see how it goes?" So what they did is for the people who had low choice and low competition, they didn't have any choice of which game they got to play. And also there's no competition because they didn't compare their score with anyone else in terms of this game. In contrast, the people who had high competition, they were instructed to record their score and compare it to other participants, who had come in to see how well they did. The people who had high freedom but low choice, well, they got to pick between one of two games. And by the way, it wasn't actually any choice. It was the exact same game, just different pictures. Or they could choose to sit and read magazines. And they didn't record their scores to compare with others. And finally was the high choice, low competition. Sorry, high choice, high competition. And again, they got to pick between the two games, but they also had competition in that they recorded their score and compared it. So the dependent variable, or the outcome variable in this case, they were curious, how long did people perceive that they were actually in this waiting room or playing this game? The participants were asked to indicate on a scale how much time they perceived had passed while they were doing the learning experiment, the one on the little computer on the computer screen, versus playing the game in the waiting room. And the assumption then was that the shorter the time that was judged, the more absorbing the experience. And we know this from a lot of leisure experiences. If you're really immersed into something, you often find that time goes much faster, or than if you're bored. The other variable that they looked at was focus of attention. So, like how absorbed you were in the activity. To measure this, they gave people a multiple choice question asking them to remember things about the waiting room, like what color was the lamp, how many pictures were on the walls, what types of magazines were there, what color was the chair. And they assumed that the less participants remembered about the waiting room, the more absorbed they were in the game, meaning the higher their focus of attention. And in fact, their results were confirmed. The people who had low freedom of choice and low competition, they were called the most things in the waiting room because they were bored. So they had their heads up and staring around. They also accurately perceived how much time had passed. Whereas people who had high choice and high competition, they didn't remember very much at all in the waiting room, and they perceived the time to have passed very quickly. So what the results of this study are saying then is that the greater the perceived freedom in choosing an activity, the higher the level of absorption. And also that a moderate amount of competition in an activity sometimes enhances leisure experiences. We'll learn later on in the course that competition can also not be very good, especially among children. But for many people, some competition is a strong motivator too. Inventories and surveys are used a lot. Personally, I'm a survey researcher, and this is often then we look at how much time or what type of activity that people have done in their free time, their frequency, and somehow usually on a scale of 0 to 5. And so there's often all these different leisure behaviors, but obviously, usually you are, you're dictating what types of activities constitute leisure on the survey. Surveys are the most frequently used measurement in leisure studies. That might be a little bit dated. I would say qualitative and interviews are maybe used just as much. And it's used most frequently when leisure style is defined then as activity, setting, or time. And so an objective view. And it's usually from the point of the researcher, so the external vantage point. And usually, researchers don't make up these activities. We use standardized or previously developed scales. Sometimes maybe custom design them to suit research purposes. So we often use them to look at leisure lifestyle or leisure style. So what is that? It's the overall pattern then of leisure activity engagement and time usage. So things like the range of activities that you do. For example, maybe you only do sports, but maybe you also do some social activities or arts and crafts or music or outdoor recreation. And we also often look then at the needs and motivations people seek and that they want to satisfy in their leisure. So looking at, is it competition that you're motivated by, or Social participation and, meeting new people? Is it personal development? We also use time budgets and diaries. And this is when you have people record in a diary or, the sequence and duration of activities that they engage in over a specified period of time. It's usually 1 week or even a couple, like a weekend and a weekday. And this is then used to estimate the amount of time participants spend in various activities. So, how much are people participating in work, leisure, maintenance activities, etc.? And so then the researcher sums up all the time in the various activities to look at and kind of figures them out using time estimates, how much time they actually spend in these different things. And so you can really look at patterns, how patterns change from workday to weekends, look at different segments of society, and also at different life cycle stages. For example, parents versus students. There's a lot of different information you can collect on these. Um, Usually it's the main activity that they're doing, when people engaged in that activity, and also what else were you doing? Like a lot of people don't just do one thing at a time. For example, you might be crocheting a scarf as your leisure activity. That's your primary activity, but your secondary activity might be that you're watching TV. Also, where you're doing the activity, at home or in a park, with whom, is it alone or in a large group? And also then if people perceive that activity as being work, leisure, or a mixture. So, and that means these time budgets, they can be looked at either from the internal or external vantage point. So the researcher could decide what activities are leisure, or you could actually, from the time diary, ask the participants to indicate which ones are work, leisure, or a mixture. For your second reflection activity, you're to complete the WADE, the what am I doing? It's a time diary. Usually you do it for a week. You'll be doing it for 1 day, and the instructions are posted on D2L. You're going to look at the time of day, the main activity you were doing, where you were, how many people you were with, how much choice did you feel in doing the activity. It's on a rating scale. Why you were participating, so like what your motivation was it for reasons that you wanted, for their own reasons, or was it for external reasons? And you'll then be looking at, what activities you did, whether it's maintenance or leisure, and kind of look at the different time that you have done in each of those activities. Fourth, we have the experience sampling method. This is also called the ecological momentary assessment. This was developed by Csikszentmihalyi and Larson. So Csikszentmihalyi is one of the researchers I've spoken to you about before, who a psychologist who studied leisure and particularly developed the theory of flow. So this was really developed by a leisure researcher. So it measures what people do in their everyday lives and their psychological states and experience during those activities. It's real time. This says respondents carry a Palm Pilot or a pager. Pardon me, I guess that's old information. Nowadays, people would, usually you can do it with a smartphone. And people then are randomly paged or signaled or beeped throughout the day. It's usually 7 to 9 times. And each time respondent is signaled, they complete a very small mini questionnaire. The questionnaire is very similar to a time diary. So the difference between a time diary and experience sampling method is that a time diary, you're filling it out like for the whole day, where this is only done for 7 to 9 moments in the day. So you might, again, you're asking the participant, what are they doing? Who are they with? You might ask their level of concentration or how much challenge they were feeling, their moods, like positive or negative, motivations, etc. And we also have naturalistic observation. So, I have chimpanzees here just because, this naturalistic observation comes from anthropology, like Jane Goodall. By the way, as an aside, I just watched a really interesting documentary on Jane Goodall with some unseen footage. It was quite good. I recommend it. It's on Netflix. So, naturalistic observation is a direct observation of people's behavior, and it's often used when we're studying people's involvement in specific activities or experience, and usually use qualitative methods. So, that means you're not looking at numbers, but you're looking at words and symbols. So, in naturalistic observation, people might do interviews, they're observing people, they might do case studies and field research. It can be quantitative or qualitative, but as I said, usually it's qualitative with words, symbols, observations. But quantitative could be like counting of things, like how often do you see a certain behavior or a certain type of person in that setting. And as an example, we uh, I had my friend Aggie Wheel for her master's research. She was interested in looking at why women might choose a non-conventional women type of leisure activity. And this happened in the Kitchener-Waterloo area, and there was at the time, Habitat for Humanity had a women's only build. So she joined the build and then observed the women while they were doing this. And she spent a whole month with them. And so that's naturalistic observation. She also had the women keep journals, and she also did interviews as well. So interviews is really when we're trying to get at understanding leisure behavior and experience from the individual's perspective. It's usually qualitative, semi-structured interviews, so you're kind of asking some preset questions, but then you can go off track and probe a bit, and it's usually around a particular theme or topic. So, for example, a few years ago, one of my master's students wanted to look at the experience of bariatric patients. So, a bariatric means people who are morbidly obese, like in contrast to like geriatrics or pediatrics. This is about bariatrics. And she was working as an occupational therapist, doing another master's in kinesiology. And she was interested in looking at the experience of bariatric patients in acute care settings because she found that she didn't think that the hospital was very equipped to meet their needs. And in fact, most hospitals have a bariatric unit nowadays. Newfoundland, we don't, and yet we do have fairly high rates of obesity. So it's a bit of a need, maybe. But she was looking then at their experiences. And interesting aside, most of them felt the quality of their experience in the hospital was just fine, and that was probably no different than anyone else. Just their needs maybe weren't being met, but they more just had a general view that the hospitals weren't that great at meeting people's needs. So, next class, we'll speak then about the strengths and limitations of these different research approaches. And then I will also provide some more specific examples of studies that use one of those 4 different typologies of defining and measuring leisure.